Iran is using proxies across multiple points in the Middle East, whether we're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or in this case, Kataib, Hezbollah in Syria and Iraq. It gives them plausible deniability.
What do you make of where this is going? The US now saying, we have approved plans, we know what we want to hit, we're ready to go.
Well, President Biden has a challenging task. He's trying to restore deterrence, try to prevent these kinds of attacks from happening again without expanding a conflict that's already escalating across multiple dimensions across the Middle East. It's very, very difficult. That said, we've been here before, we've done this before. If you think about it, Henry, we've had a low-grade conflict with Iran going back to 1979. And so there have been times where Iran has overstepped its boundaries. We've responded in a way that, at least for a time, recreated stability, which is what the United States is trying to do here.
I see Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, has said that the US is not at war with Iran and does not want to trigger a major escalation. But there has to be a response, a multi-tier response, and it's going to be over a number of days. This sounds like an almost impossible balancing act because America's critics on the right say it's by being cautious, being delicate, that whether it's the Houthis or any other jihadi-style groups, they feel they can keep pushing and pushing because America has lost its confidence. How would you respond?
Well, it is a difficult and complex task. Iran is using proxies across multiple points in the Middle East, whether we're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or in this case, Kataib, Hezbollah in Syria and Iraq. It gives them plausible deniability, but at the end of the day, they're the ones who have constructed this network, equipped these people, trained these people, and in some fashion are encouraging them to act in ways that trying to drive the United States out of the region. So it is a challenge.
Well, what does that mean, PJ? Sorry, what does that mean for the kind of targets then that the US must hit proportionately?
Sure. Well, there's going to be a ladder. For example, the first is this group. To the extent that we know who fired the drone that killed the American servicemen, where they fired it from, what their base of operations, is, that becomes a target. The second consideration is who provided, this group with a drone, with the munitions to mount on it. So if you can get at that logistics network, then you're able to reduce the capability of this group to act again. The much more difficult question is to the extent that militias in Iraq and Syria are being run by either the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, or the Quds Force. Do you take it up to the top of the ladder and say we're going to strike at the people who are driving this proxy strategy? That becomes a much more risky proposition.
I see that Iran has been warning the US not to strike Iranian territory. And interestingly, we've also had an announcement from something called Kataib Hezbollah, which is apparently Iranian-backed and a militant group, saying they're suspending their attacks on US bases inside Iraq. What do you think the correct American response to that announcement should be?
I think it's convenient that Kataib Hezbollah has said, okay, we did it once, we won't do it again, we promise. I don't think that's worth much. So I do think that at least in phase one, you attack the group and you attack their logistics network, try to reduce their capability, and then you wait and see. But then again, if there's an escalation on their part or somebody somebody else, then you have the option to to climb up the ladder further, and that could include strikes within Iran. I don't think that will be part of the initial phase.
Before Joe Biden was president, he tweeted that he thought a president should seek congressional approval before taking the country to war, before taking significant military action. At what point do you think he'll cross the threshold and be hoist by his own petard if he doesn't do that?
Sure. I think that when you're responding to an attack, a direct attack on U.S. service people, any president has the authority to respond, proportionately, to such an action. So I don't think that he needs congressional approval for a one-off or small set of military actions. If this becomes a sustained campaign, then you're quite right. He needs to get congressional buy-in. Presidents between President George W. Bush and Donald Trump have relied on authorities, whether it goes back to the Afghanistan War of 2001 or the Iraq War of 2003. Clearly, those authorities have become stale, and certainly those authorities did not imply anything regarding Iran. So I do think that while the president has some leeway here, for a short series of discrete strikes, if this is going to be a sustained campaign, he needs to have congressional buy-in.
And what of the geopolitics? Britain, America, and others in the so-called allies say that there's no connection between what these Iranian proxies have been doing in Jordan and what the Houthis have been doing in the Red Sea and what Israel is doing in Gaza. But much of the rest of the world, particularly the so-called two-thirds world, the developing world, feels that there is a connection, and the United States needs to do more to stop Israel from essentially erasing Gaza and making it uninhabitable. Isn't that the cold, hard logic? The United States needs to do more, otherwise this will continue and it will put its own troops in harm's way.
Henry, I think we've got to go back to October.
Yeah.
Why did we have the Hamas strike on Israel that at certain level defies logic? And what else was happening in the Middle East at the time? You had a very promising negotiation going on among Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel regarding normalization of relations. That was a big deal. That's something that a lot of people have been focused on for years, if not decades. And so Hamas tried to put a stop on that, or at least say, if you're going to talk about normalization, you can't exclude Palestine in that equation. So we really are at an inflection point where once the conflict in Gaza stops, we need to get back to kind of this broad conversation about the future of the Middle East. And it needs to be inclusive. It can't be driven just by the United States or Britain or Europe. It's got to be driven within the region, and it has to include, Israel. It has to include Palestine. It has to include Iran, and that's going to be a very complex conversation. And I think that Saudi Arabia may be the one that has to drive that conversation. Whether you say it's on behalf of the region, on behalf of the global South, but this is something where the region has to come together, shape an inclusive future that includes a Palestinian state, includes a secure Israel, includes Iran trying to figure out, what kind of relationship it wants with its Arab neighbors. That's a conversation we've needed for 50 years.
Yeah.
Maybe now is the opportunity where that can occur.